Hello everyone, welcome back. If you haven't already watched the videos I did on common criticisms of and opposition to the neurodiversity movement, those are not required viewing, but I still recommend watching those first. This is meant to be the third video in a mini-series, though it's also something of a detour before we reach the final stop. It builds on some of what was discussed in the previous two videos, namely the second one, but can be watched and understood without prior viewing. Today I am discussing false theories on what causes autism, with a focus on the speculated autism vaccine link. First, we will start with a quick overview on several common and disproven theories before getting into the vaccine discourse. I will give a content note here. We are talking about philosophies that have caused lots of harmful treatment and rhetoric surrounding autistic people. I also want to make a disclaimer that I am not a scientist. Viewer discretion is advised. Firstly, let's examine the history of autism itself. I've talked some about this in previous videos. Like with many things, it's hard to attribute the discovery of a concept to a single person or entity. The people I have pictured here from left to right are Leo Kanner, Grania Sukareva, Eugene Bleuler, and Hans Asperger. All four of these people were influential in being the first people to define autism. Bleuler is the first person on record to have used the word autism in the early 1900s. He believed it to be a form of childhood schizophrenia. Noticing a perceived detachment from reality he observed in certain children, he used autism, having the Greek root autos, meaning self, and he meant it to describe the morbid self-admiration and withdrawal within self. Then around 1924, a Russian psychiatrist known as Grania Sukareva described it in a few of her patients. The way she defined autism is actually pretty in line with its modern definition per the DSM-V. She described a kid as a highly intelligent introverted type with an autistic proclivity to himself. So at its root, the word autism is defined as an interest in the self, which has led to many different implications over the years. There were 5 more boys she described as having autistic tendencies. Her work was lost for many years and predated the work of Asperger and Kanner. Very little Russian research from this time period was translated into languages other than German. It's also entirely possible that Asperger deliberately made the decision not to cite her work, given that she was Jewish and Asperger was affiliated with the Nazi Party. So then Asperger's work came along, and though that was actually not translated for about 30 years until Lorna Wing took interest in it and coined Asperger's syndrome as a form of autism. Sukareva saw autism as something rooted in the brain, unlike many scientists would later. So it's likely that if her work hadn't been lost like it was, that the preceding history of autism would have looked very different. I've seen the claim that more girls would have gotten a diagnosis, and I'm not sure about that, given Sukareva's autistic patients were all boys. But it's also one of those things where if you really think hard about what could have been, you could get any number of alternate histories. We're here to talk about what happened, what was canon, if you will. Leo Kanner and Bruno Bettelheim would push the theory that autism is caused by refrigerator parents, as you can see depicted in a literal sense here, which was based on Freudian psychology. Refrigerator parents, in this case, meaning parents who are cold and unaffectionate. Freudian psychology was very popular at this time. Sigmund Freud, considered the father of psychology, was influential in how other psychologists viewed people. Many of Freud's theories have, how do I put this charitably, not aged gracefully. He was very big into the idea of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory, so the idea that behavior was caused by subconscious repressed memories and feelings, which I think is sometimes could, or at least is a small part of what can motivate people. However, this was used to give revelatory explanations like the oral stage of child development, predicting how matured their sexuality would be later in life. He also deposited the theory of an Oedipus complex, named after the play Oedipus Rex, where someone would have the repressed desires to have sex with their mom and kill their dad. The thing that stuck the most from him in the field of psychology over time was the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. Behaviorism became the dominant lens in psychology after Freud fell out of style, and I have my own criticisms of behaviorism as expressed in another video. How does this all relate to Connor and Bettelheim? They use the Freudian thought of repressed desires and childhood memories, in this case being parents not showing enough love to kids, and chalked it up as the catalyst to the supposed unaffectionate way autistic people acted towards others as they grew older. Can cold and unaffectionate parenting cause their offspring to be the same way? Sure, it can. But given how many autistic people there are and how most parents, I'd wager, attempt to be loving and affectionate, it clearly doesn't add up. Holding therapy was used as a common treatment for autism during this era because of this theory. Many parents took issue with this assertion and were skeptical that this was the cause of autism. Surely that wasn't it. Bernard Rimland came along later in the 21st century and proposed a different theory that was just as inaccurate. He combed through several textbooks after his kid was diagnosed with autism, determined to find a cure, and then published research about autism being caused by a leaky gut. His work failed to gain traction within the greater scientific field, but then it caught on with parents who were desperate to disprove Connor and Bettelheim's claims. So with their help, as well as the assistance of Ole Ivar Lovaas and Ruth Sullivan, they started a grassroots nonprofit called National Society for Autistic Children, now known as Autism Society of America. So Rimland's theory caught on in many circles after this, despite it being arguably more dubious than the last prevailing theory. He developed the Defeat Autism Now protocol, DAN, as a way of curing autism with a specific diet. Several doctors, known as DAN doctors, learned this protocol and prescribed it to people. It ended in 2011 after, surprisingly enough, it turns out it didn't work. I've talked plenty about Rimland already. He was a really awful guy. If you want to see me talk more about him, I did that in my Autism Society video, as well as the previous one on the history of opposition to the neurodiversity movement. The next two slides are dedicated to theories espoused by Simon Baron-Cohen, one of the most prolific and well-known autism researchers in the world. I've used this image before. It was created by a journalist and author, Sarah Kerchak. One of his most common theories is that autistic people have an extreme male brain. What this practically means is that even if an autistic person is female or gender nonconforming, that they have an extremely male way of thinking and perceiving the world. Never mind that gendering someone's thought patterns is strange as is. This is based on a test Baron-Cohen ran in the 90s where he noticed non-autistic women tended to score high on emotional intelligence while men scored high on pattern recognition and following rules. Since these are common traits within autistic people, he surmised that autistic people were more likely to have an extreme version of the male brain. This is likely to have led to an increased disparity of diagnosis between autistic men and women over the years. It's not the only reason for this disparity, but it is likely a significant part of it. Another well-known theory of his, though not exclusive to Baron-Cohen, is the idea that autistic people lack empathy and/or theory of mind. So in other words, autistic people struggle to imagine how other people may feel or to understand what other people's thoughts may be. Uta Frith has also been very influential in pushing this idea too. I think he's somewhat conceded that autistic people are in fact capable of empathy, but he also tends to say things that are pro-neurodiversity but then do things that aren't, like Spectrum 10K. Regardless, the idea that autistic people lack empathy has led to the very real stigma across the board. Since autistic people often look to be detached from the world around them and may have flat, expressionless voices, which I personally am definitely not an example of, that they must not care about other people. This is partially why serial killers and school shooters get armchair diagnosed as autistic. If they fit the lone wolf archetype and autistic people lack empathy or interest in human connection, then they are supposedly more prone to heinously murdering others. This isn't to say every autistic person is empathetic. though I do know many autistic people who are very empathetic. But it is to say that it is a gross underestimation of autistic people who do care about others and seek attachments. We as people, and I'd argue that as living things, are inherently communal. We exist to care for and depend on one another. I think because it's common for an autistic person to maybe be more secretive about who they spend time with or care about, or because many of us are often very blunt, that it has historically been misconstrued as not having empathy. It's also true that we tend to be more empathetic towards each other than neurotypicals are towards us, resulting in what Damian Milton has described as the double empathy problem. The last theory I wanted to get into before we talk about vaccines is what I consider to be the most ridiculous and outlandish theory on autism in existence. That being, autistic people are distantly related to Neanderthals, who were autistic. Neanderthals are thought to have been a species that existed before Homo sapiens did. So for this to be true, there would have to have been inbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, which is possible but not likely considering they both only existed for a very slim period of time. It also comes with the assumption autistic people are simply not human and less evolved than Homo sapiens. Not much is even actually known about the Neanderthals. This line of thinking comes from how Neanderthals weren't as social as Homo sapiens and were more focused on hunting and gathering food, but were misunderstood and stigmatized for their perceived oddities. This theory was bounced around on email lists and then developed more by Leif Ekblad, who used his Aspie quiz to see if they are autistic as evidence for this. Many people take this quiz to see if they are autistic before seeking a diagnosis, unaware of the ulterior motive behind it. Ekblad's ideas are rooted in evolutionary psychology, which is discredited and a form of eugenics. The quiz itself is actually not meant for autistic people with an IQ of 80 or lower, hence the Aspie quiz. The wildest part is that this theory came from autistic spaces and autistic people. Has it caused the most widespread harm and stigma to autistic people? Definitely not. However, it is an absolutely preposterous theory, and I find it more funny than anything. So now we get into the anti-vaxxer movement and how it has overlapped with autism discourse over the past several decades. One very important thing to keep in mind is that opposition to vaccines has existed since vaccines were invented. The cartoon on the right is from 1894. It was clearly made to depict vaccines as frightening, using the imagery of a snake and a skeleton to instill fear. The cartoon on the left is from 1805, using deformed bodies and demons as a symbol for what vaccines, or in this case, inoculation, could do to you. Many of the people who opposed vaccines in the 19th century were lower and working class British citizens. It was new science, and many were skeptical of its effectiveness and safety. They didn't like the idea that this new treatment was to be mandated by the government, despite it being vital to protecting people against diseases such as smallpox. It's also easy to make needles look scary. The anti-vaxxer movement of the modern age is similar in a lot of ways to the vaccine hesitancy of yore. Here's a model for the sliding scale of vaccine hesitancy. Many people will accept common vaccines, even if they aren't particularly interested in the science of them. There are also a number of different reasons for people to refuse vaccines, and they may only refuse specific vaccines or vaccinate on a different schedule than what the CDC recommends. The most vocal anti-vaxxers, as you can imagine, are in the red in this graphic. Not everyone who doesn't vaccinate does it because they are an anti-vaxxer. If they are allergic to the ingredients used, for example, then they can't get certain vaccines. Another common reason for refusing vaccines is religious beliefs. Some workplaces and schools will allow this as an exemption. This is easily abusable, and I could certainly argue as to why I personally think religion is an inadequate excuse, but I don't want to go there today. It's also very complicated in the black community in particular due to the history of black people being exploited in vaccine trials, namely the Tuskegee syphilis study. All of this is to say that there are many ways in which people are anti-vaccine or hesitant to vaccinate. not all necessarily being part of the anti-vaxxer movement or even being vocal opponents to vaccines. What I am focusing on today is the people who are or have been vocal opponents. Many in the anti-vaxxer movement are people who believe conspiracy theories, namely about vaccines. Conspiracy theorists have a very specific thought pattern that's hard to break. We saw a lot of this in particular a few years ago during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2020 election. People being stuck at home with more incentive to use the internet than ever is one of the reasons for the proliferation of conspiracy theories. It was also easy to capitalize off of people's fears and uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. As simple as it is to debunk a conspiracy theory, that doesn't make it easy to convince someone of its falsehood. Quite the opposite. If someone is deep enough into any belief, pulling them in the opposite direction is no easy task. With regards to false conspiracy theories, you can supply them with direct evidence that contradicts their claims, but the evidence you show them is then labeled as biased. Independent fact checkers are biased or even in on the conspiracy, so they may believe there's a conspiracy with the fact checkers too. Many people who believe conspiracy theories also think there's a malicious intent, that certain people, namely those with some kind of authority, are using covert methods to control the way we live and think, and may even be part of an underground cabal. Obviously, people would never publicly admit to being part of big conspiracies unless they got caught, so that only acts as proof to these people. With regards to vaccines, anti-vaxxers typically believe that big pharma, that being pharmaceutical companies and government entities like the CDC, is trying to control everyone's lifestyle for their own personal gain. They may think this is to make the population more vulnerable and submissive, or even to implant microchips into our bodies to increase surveillance. The belief that autism is caused by vaccines is part of this. Their misguided beliefs on autism make them think that big pharma wants to weaken the population by giving people autism, or want to manufacture a problem, that being autism, and then sell the solution, that being therapies. The numerous studies that disprove the vaccine autism link are disregarded because they tell you the people who conduct them have a vested interest, or the studies are inconclusive and the ones they believe somehow aren't. It's a tough steel trap to escape for those that believe it, and the most vocal conspiracy theories deliberately put them in these in the first place. The modern anti-vaxxer movement is commonly attributed to a study that former Dr. Andrew Wakefield published in 1997 that linked the rise in autism diagnoses to the increase in childhood vaccinations, namely the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. He was not the first person to speculate this. I've found emails that predate Wakefield's study of people questioning whether the sudden regression they saw in their kids was possibly due to vaccines they gave them. Rimland also bought into this as a possible explanation. Wakefield's study, it turns out, had completely fabricated data, leading him to losing his medical license in 2010. The interesting thing about Wakefield is that he was trying to disavow mainstream vaccines in an attempt to push his own patented vaccines, as well as a cure for autism. He has certainly played a major role in the modern day anti-vaxxer movement, even well after losing his license. If anything, that has only given him more incentive to continue to convince his audience. They rejected me and tried to silence me for telling the truth. Speculation about a link between autism and vaccines was fairly mainstream for quite a while. Some of this has to do with organizations like Rimland's Autism Research Institute and Autism Speaks funding further research on it, and it even seeped into the 2008 presidential election. Both of the major candidates for president, John McCain and Barack Obama, at different points in their campaigns spoke of the possibility. Now, Obama has since walked this back and has done some work with pro-neurodiversity advocates, even rewarding some during his presidency. But it comes to show that these beliefs were not fringe. McCain never publicly changed his tone, though since he passed away 5 years ago, it's hard to tell what his public stance would be now. He was a more moderate Republican, definitely moderate by 2023 standards, so he may have adopted a pro-vaccine, at least pro-true information about vaccines, position, but again, it's hard to say for certain. If anything, the right-wing Republicans have done the most to propagate the anti-vaxxer movement in their party and base. Trump ran on a very anti-vaccine platform in 2016, talking about the supposed autism epidemic. He has personal relationships with the Wrights, the co-founders of Autism Speaks, who actually played a pretty significant role in making Trump more famous via The Apprentice. His anti-vax rhetoric was more silent in 2020 due to the pandemic, though he has recently started expressing vaccine autism-linked rhetoric once more. His supporters tend to be anti-vax, as well as other right-wing Republicans, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene. Several celebrities have played a role in propagating the myth of the autism vaccine link, namely the three you see here: Jenny McCarthy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and J.B. Handley. They all started various nonprofits such as Generation Rescue, the Children's Health Defense Fund, and Safe Minds to combat mainstream vaccines. They have argued that there are ingredients in vaccines that make them unsafe, such as mercury and thimerosal. These nonprofits supposedly exist to push for greener vaccines and to right the wrongs of big pharma, though are very sketchy and in practice mainly further propagate harmful misinformation about autism and about vaccines. The Children's Health Defense Fund is particularly making waves within right-wing conspiracy spaces. Even though RFK Jr. is running Democratic next year, he is playing to a reactionary base. Despite all these people who have all these people have done to stand in the way of the neurodiversity movement and spread a harmful stigma, it seems like they're now trying to change their tone, though whether this is because of an actual change of heart or if it's a ploy to more covertly push the same things as usual is debatable. J.B. Handley learned about spelling to communicate, which he used for his son Jamie, and it worked wonders. So they co-wrote and published a book in 2021 called Underestimated: An Autism Miracle. I haven't read the book, but I have seen the press surrounding it, and it feels like they're using the language of presuming competence, which is a core value of neurodiversity affirming practices, to now sell to a new audience on top of the audience they've already garnered from their anti-vax escapades. As I talked about in the previous video, anti-vaxxers are usually against mainstream treatments, so this includes ABA. Since spelling to communicate and rapid prompting method are considered debunked pseudoscience, this makes for a strange bedfellow with people who actually do have pseudoscientific beliefs. They see letterboards as an alternative treatment. So even though it's not obvious that with this book or with the new documentary Spellers, they are now trying to create their own version called the Spellers method, which they came up with very hastily and seem to be trying to credit themselves as the originators of some sort of revolution where they are exploiting a vulnerable population, that being people who use typing and spelling to communicate, to make money. They're just doing it under the guise of supporting it under self-advocacy and presumption of competence instead of outright portraying them as mindless husks like they previously did. They're co-opting neurodiversity adjacent concepts for money. People like J.B. Handley and Jenny McCarthy never actually cared about these causes. They are wealthy people who want to make more money. It's frustrating to see people uncritically support these initiatives, namely the Spellers documentary. In my experience, they're either unaware of the anti-vaxxers backing it, or they try to argue that their anti-vax beliefs are irrelevant here and should be ignored because of what this could do to help non-speakers and practitioners alike. And that's the thing. Yes, these initiatives could lead to people getting the communication access they need, and can help persuade professionals to change their outlook on disability. That's not a bad thing. What is a bad thing is the dirty money being made from this and how the non-speakers caught in the crosshairs of this campaign being at an impasse where they either stay silent on the quack beliefs of Hanley et al., and it's assumed they're being puppeted as per usual, or if they speak out, risk losing communication support for being badly behaved. It also is giving more ammunition to the people that are trying to disprove letterboards as a valid form of communication. So I have patience for those people. I understand they may be in a very particular predicament. However, in the act of presuming competence, I also understand they may know about these things and be okay with them. Spellers is not a good thing, and it is my opinion that you can't separate the anti-vax beliefs of its producers from the film. This is a very difficult conversation to have because of everything I've mentioned. It would be one thing if Hanley, McCarthy, and Kennedy publicly apologized for their previous advocacy on vaccines and disavowed said advocacy, but they haven't. In fact, in Kennedy's case, he is continuing to further anti-vaccine rhetoric. I may catch some flack for what I am saying, but it's the truth. Contrary to what you may be thinking, I am doing this because I care about non-speakers and the integrity of communication access. And I care that influential people are inserting themselves into a community they have previously undermined the work of and trying to push their own fraudulent practices that only ruin the credibility of legitimate practices people are already skeptical of. Mel wrote a great essay about something similar that happened with Cure Autism Now in the 2000s. I will post it in the description. The beliefs about vaccines causing autism and autism being caused by outside forces have very real consequences. Several pseudoscientific treatments have developed out of this school of thought. I already talked a little bit about the DAN protocol, but there's also chelation, where you give your autistic offspring a specific diet to try and mitigate their autism symptoms. While a proper diet can in fact help offset some of the hardships autism can cause, this goes much further than that. In 2005, an autistic kid named Abubakar Tariq Nadama was given this treatment by a doctor in Philadelphia and died from it. There is also a product known as Miracle Mineral Solution, which includes bleach that is sold to parents as a cure for autism. Drinking bleach is deadly. There are people trying to stop these products from being sold, but the main reason they're profitable is because of the harmful stigma surrounding autism and the exploitation of very real fears parents have. Another way people try to cure autism is through prayer, which is true of many other disabilities too. It sucks that there are so many supposed autism treatments that can be traumatizing and even outright lethal at worst. But that is the result of stigma, and it is something the neurodiversity movement has long been pushing back against. So now here's something lighthearted. There was a funny incident in 2010 where Jamie Hanley got angry at the blogger of Autism Hub's Left Brain, Right Brain, which, by the way, has done a great job over the years of countering a lot of the misinformation I talked about today. There was a blogger with the alias Sully. Hanley thought that this blogger was secretly Bonnie Offit, the wife of well-known vaccine scientist Paul Offit. He only thought this because Liz Ditz made a comment, and Hanley thought the she in her comment was Sully. Uh, the fact that he thought his wife was using an internet blog to own them is pretty funny. Now, Paul Offit also has some harmful views on autism, but he has done a lot to push back on the notion that vaccines cause autism and continues to. The actual guy with the alias was a father named Matt Carey. So, there you heard it here, folks. Sully from Monsters, Inc. is actually Bonnie Offit. So all of this begs the question, what is the truth? What actually is autism, and what is the real cause? Well, the second part is yet to be known for sure. Autism is definitely a cognitive disability and a particular brain wiring. We definitely know this to be true in this day and age. The most credible research on the cause of autism suggests that its cause is genetic. There are some sticky ethics surrounding the research on said genetic causation and what could be done with further knowledge of said cause, but I have expressed my thoughts on that in other videos and don't want that to be a focus here. The graphic I found, made by Ann Corwin, who used to run a blog called Existence is Wonderful, does an excellent job of describing the different ways autism has been described and perceived over the years, and where those specific perceptions come from. Two of these three categories are observations the outside world makes of autistic people, while the third category is only possible to describe if you are autistic. Most of what gets autistic people diagnosed in the first place is the outward behaviors, stuff that is readily visible. Since autism is not a physical disability, what most people see and label autism historically and in the present day is behavior. That's where the idea that autism is a behavioral disorder comes from. Actual brain scans and observing the neurology of autistic people can certainly be a boon in understanding how the autistic brain works. though it's still limited in that there really isn't one definitive type of autistic brain. Rather, trends among the brains of autistic people, and probably cousins too, I'd imagine. Which is also an important thing to consider. Autism's origins stem from schizophrenia, which is another neurotype. All of these are names phenomena have been ascribed as observed by humans, and that is as ever-changing as is all of science. If there's one thing about science I know, it's that. The sheer complexity and diversity in presentation autism and similar conditions have is one of the most beautiful things about it. It's something I like about being able to meet autistics and cousins of all kinds. Even with said complexity, there is much relatability among us, and though it leads to stark division and does not guarantee we all will like each other, it can lead to some very meaningful connections and long-lasting relationships. What you want to call it can be important, but in a lot of ways, it doesn't even matter if you're relating to someone in an important way. As critical as I often am of this community and movement, there is one simple truth I will always hold, and it's that ACs are my people, and are a damn beautiful part of this world that deserve to be treated fairly. Thank you for watching. Next video will be the last in this series, where we will be plunging to the depths and examining how opposition to the neurodiversity movement often aligns itself with the far right. Hope to see you then.